The sun was setting over Cedar Heights, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Police Chief Derek Thompson loosened his tie and gathered his belongings from his desk. The day had been particularly demanding, filled with budget meetings, community outreach programs, and the usual stack of paperwork that came with being the city's first black police chief. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, his wife and 2 teenage daughters smiling back at him from their summer vacation. 6 months into his new role as chief, he'd barely had time to breathe, let alone spend quality time with his family. Tonight, though, he promised to make it home for dinner. The police headquarters was quieting down for the evening, with the day shift heading out and the night shift trickling in. As Thompson walked through the building, he exchanged warm greetings with his officers. He'd worked hard to create a more inclusive and community-focused department, though he knew there was still much work to be done. In the parking garage, Thompson clicked his key fob, and his dark blue SUV's lights blinked in response. It was his personal vehicle, a reward to himself after 20 years of dedicated service to the force. The leather seats still had that new car smell, and the premium sound system made his evening commute something to look forward to. Instead of taking his usual route home, Thompson decided to drive through the scenic Oakwood district. The neighborhood was known for its historic mansions, tree-lined streets, and well-manicured lawns. As a kid, he'd only seen these houses from the bus window while riding to school. Now, as police chief, he made it a point to patrol all neighborhoods equally, breaking the old patterns of over-policing some areas while barely maintaining a presence in others. As he drove, Thompson reflected on the changes he'd implemented since taking office. His department had launched new training programs focused on de-escalation and community relations. They'd started a youth mentorship program and regular town halls where residents could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. The progress was slow but steady. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Don't forget to pick up the garlic bread." Thompson smiled, remembering she was making his favorite pasta dish tonight. That younger daughter had made the honor roll, and this dinner was meant to be a celebration. The houses in Oakwood seemed to grow larger and more impressive with each block. Thompson drove carefully, staying well within the speed limit. Even as police chief, he never took chances. Years of experience had taught him that a black man driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood could attract unwanted attention, regardless of his position or achievements. He'd learned this lesson early in his career. As a rookie officer, he'd witnessed how differently his white colleagues treated people based on their appearance and zip code. Those observations had fueled his determination to rise through the ranks and change the system from within. Through his rearview mirror, Thompson noticed a patrol car that had turned onto the street behind him. He maintained his steady pace, hands properly positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, habits ingrained from decades of being both a cop and a black man in America. The patrol car kept its distance but remained behind him for several blocks. Thompson recognized this familiar dance, the subtle pressure of being followed, the unspoken question of whether he belonged in this neighborhood. Even in his position as chief, these moments still occurred, serving as stark reminders of why his work was so essential. His mind wandered to the new batch of officers who'd graduated from the academy last month. He'd given a speech emphasizing the importance of treating every community member with dignity and respect. "Your badge is not a symbol of power," he told them, "but a symbol of public trust." The late evening light cast long shadows across the road as Thompson approached the intersection where he turned toward the grocery store. The temperature display on his dashboard showed 72 degrees, a perfect spring evening. He'd rolled down his windows earlier to enjoy the fresh air and the scent of blooming magnolias. The music playing softly through his speakers was interrupted by a news update about community policing initiatives across the country. Thompson listened intently, always eager to learn from other departments' successes and failures. His own experience had shown him that lasting change required both bold leadership and careful attention to detail. As he drove past the local park, he noticed families packing up their picnic supplies and children making the most of the remaining daylight on the playground. This was what community policing was all about, ensuring that everyone felt safe enjoying their neighborhood, regardless of who they were or where they lived. Thompson checked his watch, calculating whether he had time to stop by his mother's house before picking up the garlic bread. She lived just a few blocks off his route, and she always loved his impromptu visits. She'd been his biggest supporter throughout his career, from his first day at the academy to his appointment as chief. The weight of his service weapon against his hip reminded him of the responsibility he carried, both as a law enforcement officer and as a role model for young people in his community. He'd never forgotten the impact that seeing his first black police officer had made on him as a child. It had opened his eyes to possibilities he hadn't known existed. Lost in thought, Thompson almost missed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The patrol car that had been following him was now signaling for him to pull over. He felt his shoulders tense as years of training and personal experience kicked in. As he carefully pulled to the curb, Thompson took a deep breath, knowing that what happened next could either reinforce or challenge everything he was working to change in his department. His phone buzzed again, probably his wife wondering about the garlic bread, but Thompson's attention was now fully focused on the approaching footsteps behind his vehicle. Despite his position, despite his accomplishments, he was about to face a situation that reminded him that some challenges persisted, even for a police chief. Officer James Reynolds was 3 months into his job with the department, working the evening shift in the quiet Oakwood district. The sun had nearly set, and the streetlights were flickering to life when he first noticed the dark blue SUV cruising through the neighborhood. Something about the vehicle caught his attention. Maybe it was the tinted windows, or perhaps it was just that he didn't recognize it as belonging to any of the regular residents. Reynolds had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and old habits died hard. New to the city, he still found himself categorizing vehicles and people as either belonging or not belonging. It was a mindset he didn't realize he carried, one that would soon force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Following at a distance, Reynolds ran the plates through his system. The SUV was registered locally, but something still nagged at him. He watched as the vehicle maintained perfect speed, never going even a mile over the limit. The driver's posture seemed almost too correct, too careful. In Reynolds' limited experience, this level of precision often indicated someone trying too hard not to draw attention. His training officer's words echoed in his mind, "Trust your instincts." But what Reynolds hadn't yet learned was the difference between instincts and prejudices, between reasonable suspicion and unfounded bias. The line between good policing and profiling was one he hadn't been forced to examine too closely until now. As the SUV turned onto Maple Avenue, Reynolds made his decision. He flipped on his lights, already rehearsing in his mind the explanation he'd give for the stop. Equipment violation, suspicious behavior. He hadn't actually witnessed any traffic violations, but he convinced himself that a quick check wouldn't hurt anyone. The SUV's response was textbook perfect, signal on, smooth deceleration, pulling over to a safe distance from the curb. Reynolds noted how the driver kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, almost as if they'd done this before, as if they were familiar with police procedures. Following protocol, Reynolds radioed in his location and the license plate number. He adjusted his body camera and stepped out of his patrol car, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the SUV's spotless paint job and luxury trim. It was the kind of vehicle that seemed out of place in this neighborhood at this hour, at least, that's what Reynolds told himself. His approach was cautious, professional on the surface, but with an underlying tension. The flashlight beam moved methodically. Trunk, rear window, back seat, driver's side mirror. No sudden movements from inside the vehicle, just the same steady grip on the steering wheel he noticed before. Reynolds' hand rested near his holster, a habit formed in training that he hadn't yet learned to question. The weight of his badge felt heavy tonight, though he couldn't have explained why. Something about this stop felt different, significant in a way he didn't yet understand. The tint of the windows made it difficult to see the driver clearly, but as Reynolds drew closer, he could make out the outline of a well-dressed black man. The officer's grip on his flashlight tightened slightly, an unconscious reaction he would later be forced to examine. "Good evening, sir," Reynolds began, his voice carrying the artificial authority of a rookie trying to sound more confident than he felt. "License and registration, please." He didn't offer a reason for the stop, an oversight that spoke volumes about his true motivations. Inside the SUV, Thompson remained still, his hands exactly where they needed to be. Years of experience had taught him how to handle moments like these, though he'd hoped his position would have made them a thing of the past. The irony of being pulled over in his own jurisdiction wasn't lost on him. Reynolds watched as the driver slowly, almost too slowly, announced his movements before reaching for his documents. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made Reynolds pause. The interior light clicked on, and Reynolds got his first clear look at the driver. The man was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Reynolds made in a month, his tie loosened slightly after what had clearly been a long day at work. But it was the expression on his face that caught Reynolds' attention, not anger, not fear, but something more complex, more challenging. As the driver carefully extracted his license and registration, Reynolds noticed his hands were steady, his movements deliberate. This wasn't someone nervous about an encounter with law enforcement. This was someone who knew exactly how to handle the situation. The documents were extended through the window, held with a certainty that made Reynolds uncomfortable. He took them, his flashlight beam dropping to examine the credentials. The first thing he noticed was the driver's license photo, a perfect match for the man behind the wheel. The second thing he noticed made his stomach drop. There, alongside the standard license, was a police ID. Not just any police ID, but one marked with the distinctive insignia of the chief's office. Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face as realization dawned. He was standing outside the car of Police Chief Thompson, the man who had given an inspiring speech at Reynolds' Academy graduation just 3 months ago. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as Reynolds' hand began to shake. In that moment, all his justifications for the stop evaporated, leaving him face to face with the uncomfortable truth about his own assumptions and biases. The weight of what he'd done, profiling his own police chief, began to sink in. Chief Thompson's voice cut through the awkward silence. "Officer, would you mind explaining why you pulled me over tonight?" The question was posed calmly, professionally, but with an undercurrent that made it clear this would be more than a routine traffic stop for both of them. Reynolds stood frozen, his mind racing to find an explanation that wouldn't sound as hollow as he suddenly realized it was. The quiet of the neighborhood seemed to press in around him, broken only by the idle of both engines and the distant sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus. This moment, standing on the side of a quiet street in an upscale neighborhood, was about to become a turning point in Officer Reynolds' career, though not in the way he might have expected when he first spotted the SUV. The next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about policing, about his own beliefs, and about what it meant to truly serve and protect all members of his community. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Officer Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to the other, still holding the flashlight beam steady. His throat felt dry as he tried to formulate a response to the chief's question about the reason for the stop. "Sir, I noticed your vehicle in the area," and Reynolds paused, already hearing how weak his explanation sounded. "I thought it seemed suspicious for this neighborhood at this hour." The words hung in the air, their implications becoming clearer with each passing second. Chief Thompson's hands remained on the steering wheel, his gaze steady and direct. "And what exactly made my vehicle suspicious, Officer Reynolds?" The question was posed calmly, but it carried the weight of decades of similar encounters. Reynolds felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Well, sir, I didn't recognize the vehicle as belonging to any of the regular residents and—" He stopped himself, suddenly aware of how this sounded. "So you're familiar with every vehicle that belongs in this neighborhood?" Thompson's question was measured, educational rather than confrontational. "Do you keep a list of which cars are allowed here after dark?" The young officer's chest tightened as he realized the corner he backed himself into. His training had covered racial profiling, but standing here now, he was facing the reality of his own biases in a way no classroom session could have prepared him for. "No, sir, I don't keep a list," Reynolds admitted, his voice smaller than before. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as his hand trembled. Thompson let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "Officer, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. If you'd seen a white man in a suit driving this same vehicle through this neighborhood, would you have followed him for 6 blocks before pulling him over?" The question hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was unavoidable. I noticed you had your hand near your weapon when you approached my vehicle, Thompson continued. Standard procedure, yes, but I'm curious. Did you see anything that suggested I might be a threat? Any suspicious movements? Any traffic violations? Reynolds found himself replaying the entire sequence of events in his mind. The perfect driving, the careful adherence to speed limits, the professional response to being pulled over, none of it had actually been suspicious. What had really caught his attention was simply the combination of an expensive vehicle, a black driver, and an upscale neighborhood. No, sir, Reynolds finally admitted. There were no violations or suspicious behaviors. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The chief's next words were unexpected. Would you like to know how many times I've been pulled over in situations just like this one? Not as police chief, but as a black man driving in neighborhoods where some people think I don't belong. Reynolds felt his ears burning with shame, but he managed to respond, Yes, sir, I would. Too many times to count, Thompson said, his voice carrying years of accumulated experience. And each time, the officer had some explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface. Equipment check, routine patrol, suspicious behavior. But underneath all those explanations was always the same unspoken question. What is someone like you doing in a neighborhood like this? A car passed by slowly, its headlights illuminating both men for a moment. Reynolds saw his own reflection in the SUV's window, a young officer who had thought he was doing his job, now facing the consequences of assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. Sir, I apologize, Reynolds began, but Thompson held up a hand to stop him. Officer, I'm not interested in apologies right now. What I'm interested in is understanding. Tell me what you see when you look at me now, with the knowledge of who I am. Reynolds studied his chief's face, seeing beyond his initial assumptions for the first time. He saw a man who had likely worked twice as hard to achieve his position, who had faced countless obstacles and prejudices, who had risen to lead the department despite the very attitudes Reynolds had just displayed. I see, my superior officer, Reynolds started, then corrected himself. No, I see a respected law enforcement professional who deserves better than to be treated with suspicion in his own jurisdiction. Thompson nodded slowly. And what did you see when you first spotted my vehicle? Before you knew who I was? The question hung in the air, demanding honesty. Reynolds felt his professional facade crumbling as he confronted the truth. I saw what I expected to see. What I was trained to see as suspicious, even though that training wasn't official or written down anywhere. The sound of crickets filled the silence between them. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere a car door slammed. The normal sounds of the neighborhood continued, oblivious to the profound moment of reckoning happening on this quiet street. Officer Reynolds, Thompson said, his tone shifting slightly, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be difficult. I want you to get in your car and think about this encounter. Think about every decision you made, from the moment you first noticed my vehicle until now. Think about what those decisions say about the kind of officer you want to be. Reynolds nodded, unable to find words that seemed adequate for the moment. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., my office, Thompson continued. We're going to have a longer conversation about this, not as a disciplinary measure, but as an opportunity for growth. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Reynolds managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. And, officer? Thompson added as Reynolds began to turn away. Don't let this moment be just another uncomfortable memory you try to forget. Let it be the beginning of something better. Reynolds walked back to his patrol car, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he watched the chief's SUV pull away, he realized that this evening hadn't just been about a traffic stop. It had been about confronting the invisible biases that shaped his actions, the unconscious prejudices that influenced his decisions. The rest of his shift stretched ahead of him, but Reynolds knew he wouldn't be the same officer tomorrow that he had been when he started his patrol today. The chief's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to examine not just this one incident, but every assumption he ever made about who belonged where and why. Officer Reynolds' hands were trembling slightly as he examined the credentials in his flashlight beam. The police chief's identification card stared back at him, and the realization of what he'd just done hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just any motorist he'd pulled over, this was Chief Thompson, his direct superior and the man leading their entire department. The night air suddenly felt colder as Reynolds stood frozen in place, his mind racing through the implications of his actions. He remembered Chief Thompson's speech at his academy graduation just 3 months ago, talking about building trust between law enforcement and the community. Now here he was, having just profiled his own chief. "Is there a problem with my credentials, Officer Reynolds?" Thompson's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. The young officer's mouth went dry as he tried to form words. "No, sir. No problem at all, Chief Thompson." Reynolds' voice cracked slightly as he spoke. He lowered the flashlight, its beam now pointing at the ground, though the damage was already done. The aggressive stance he'd taken during his approach now felt foolish and exposed. The chief's next words were unexpected. "Turn off your flashlight, Officer Reynolds, and look at me properly." The command was gentle but firm. Reynolds complied, clicking off the light and allowing his eyes to adjust to the softer glow of the street lamps. In the ambient light, he could see Chief Thompson's expression clearly for the first time, not angry as he'd feared, but thoughtful and evaluating. The chief's hands were still on the steering wheel, exactly where he'd placed them when first pulled over. "Do you know why I haven't moved my hands, officer?" Thompson asked, his eyes steady on the young officer's face. Reynolds felt his professional demeanor crumbling under that gaze. Because it's proper procedure during a traffic stop, sir," Reynolds answered, knowing even as he spoke that this wasn't the full answer. "That's part of it," Thompson acknowledged. "But I've kept my hands here because even as the chief of police, I understand that a black man's movements during a traffic stop can be misinterpreted. Even in my position, I take no chances." The words hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. He remembered his own approach, hand near his holster, flashlight beam aggressive and questioning. He'd been ready for trouble before he'd even seen who was behind the wheel. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Reynolds stammered, feeling the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. "Then don't say anything yet. Just listen." Thompson's voice took on a teaching tone. "When you followed my vehicle, what did you actually observe that was suspicious?" Reynolds tried to recall his justification for the stop, but each reason now seemed hollow. "Your vehicle seemed out of place in this neighborhood, sir." Even as he said it, he realized how it sounded. "Out of place?" Thompson repeated the words carefully. "I live 3 blocks from here, Officer Reynolds. This is my neighborhood. But even if it wasn't, think about what you're saying. When did an expensive car become suspicious in an expensive neighborhood?" Reynolds felt his face growing hot with shame. The chief continued, "What made you really pull me over tonight? Was it the car? The neighborhood? Or was it the glimpse you got of the driver through the tinted windows?" The question hung in the air between them. Reynolds couldn't meet his chief's eyes anymore, the truth of his actions becoming unbearably clear. "This is a moment of choice, Officer Reynolds," Thompson said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "You can either learn from this, or you can try to justify it. Which will it be?" Reynolds took a deep breath, straightening his posture slightly. "I want to learn, sir. I need to learn." "Good," Thompson nodded. "Because this moment isn't just about you and me. It's about every traffic stop you'll make in your career. It's about every citizen you'll interact with. It's about the kind of officer you choose to be." A car passed by slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating both men. Reynolds saw his reflection in the chief's window, young, uncertain, and facing a crucial moment in his career. "Tell me what you're thinking right now," Thompson prompted, his tone encouraging honest reflection. "I'm thinking about how quickly I made assumptions," Reynolds admitted. "How I didn't even question my own motivations until I saw your ID. And I'm wondering how many other times I've done this without realizing it." Thompson nodded slowly. "That's a good place to start. Self-awareness is the first step toward change. But it can't stop there. These realizations have to translate into action." Reynolds shifted his weight, feeling the full impact of this impromptu lesson. "How do you suggest I move forward from this, sir?" "First, by understanding that this moment isn't about punishment, it's about growth." Thompson's voice carried years of experience. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to come to my office. We're going to have a longer conversation about what happened tonight, and more importantly, about what happens next." "Yes, sir," Reynolds responded, his voice steadier now. And Officer Reynolds. Thompson added, when you go back to your patrol car tonight, I want you to think about something. Think about how many other Chief Thompsons you might have pulled over. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners, all assumed suspicious because they didn't fit your idea of who belongs where. The words settled heavily in Reynolds's chest as he stood there, his citation book forgotten in his hand. This traffic stop had become something much more significant, a turning point in his understanding of what it meant to truly protect and serve all members of the community. You're dismissed for now, officer, Thompson said finally. But remember, tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp, we have work to do. As Reynolds walked back to his patrol car, each step felt different somehow. The weight of his badge seemed heavier, but not in a burdensome way. Instead, it felt like the weight of responsibility, of the need to do better, to be better. The chief's SUV pulled away smoothly, leaving Reynolds alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of the patrol car's engine. The rest of his shift stretched ahead of him, but he knew he'd be patrolling with different eyes now. Eyes that would hopefully see people first, not assumptions. Chief Thompson gestured to the passenger seat of his SUV. Take a seat, Officer Reynolds. I think we need to have a real conversation about what just happened. Reynolds hesitated for a moment, then slid into the passenger seat. The leather was soft and expensive, but he couldn't relax into it. His uniform felt stiff and uncomfortable as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. First, I want you to understand something, Thompson began, turning slightly to face the young officer. This isn't about making you feel guilty. This is about understanding and growth. The dashboard clock showed 8:45 p.m. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly then fell silent. Reynolds found himself focusing on these small details, anything to avoid the intensity of the moment. Tell me about your background, Thompson said, surprising Reynolds with the direction of the conversation. Where did you grow up? What made you want to become a police officer? Reynolds took a deep breath. Small town in the Midwest, sir. Population about 3,000. Mostly farming community. I wanted to be an officer because, well, our local police were like family to everyone. They knew everybody's name, helped out when people needed it. I wanted to be that kind of officer. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. That's a good foundation, but city policing is different, isn't it? More complex, more diverse. Yes, sir, Reynolds agreed. In my hometown, everyone kind of looked the same, lived the same way. Here, he trailed off, realizing what he was admitting. Here, you're dealing with people from all walks of life, Thompson finished for him. Different backgrounds, different experiences, different expectations of law enforcement. The chief reached into the backseat and grabbed a water bottle, offering it to Reynolds before taking one for himself. The simple gesture helped ease some of the tension. Let me tell you a story, Thompson continued. When I first became an officer 25 years ago, I was assigned to patrol the very neighborhood we're sitting in now. One day, I was off duty, driving my personal car. I got pulled over 3 times in one afternoon. Reynolds nearly choked on his water. 3 times, sir? 3 times. Each officer had their reason. One said my taillight was out. It wasn't. Another claimed I matched the description of a suspect. I didn't. The third was honest enough to admit he'd never seen me in the neighborhood before. The chief's words hung in the air as Reynolds processed their meaning. How did you handle that, sir? The same way I handled being pulled over tonight, Thompson replied, with dignity, patience, and the hope that each encounter might lead to understanding. But here's the difference. I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans those times. Tonight, I'm in a suit with a chief's badge, and it still happened. Reynolds felt the shame creeping back, but Thompson held up a hand. Remember, this isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. Tell me honestly, what made you follow my vehicle tonight? I saw an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood. Reynolds began slowly, forcing himself to be honest. When I saw the driver was black, I automatically assumed something wasn't right. I didn't even question that assumption until I saw your ID. Thompson took a sip of water. And what does that tell you about the way you're approaching your job? That I'm letting prejudices guide my actions instead of facts, Reynolds admitted. That I'm not really serving and protecting if I'm viewing some citizens as automatically suspicious. Now we're getting somewhere, Thompson nodded. But here's the bigger question. What are you going to do about it? Reynolds thought carefully before responding. I need to examine my assumptions, question my instincts when they're based on bias rather than behavior. But, sir, how do I know the difference? That's exactly the right question to ask, Thompson said, approval evident in his voice. Let's break down tonight's stop. What actual suspicious behavior did you observe? None, Reynolds admitted. Perfect speed limit compliance, proper signaling, no equipment violations. If anything, the driving was exemplary. So what you're saying is you pulled over a law-abiding citizen because they didn't fit your preconception of who should be driving an expensive car in this neighborhood. Put that way, it sounded even worse. Reynolds nodded silently. Here's what we're going to do, Thompson said, his tone shifting to one of action. Starting next week, you're going to work with our community outreach program. You'll meet residents from every neighborhood, hear their stories, understand their experiences with law enforcement. Yes, sir, Reynolds responded, feeling a mix of nervousness and relief at having a concrete path forward. And one more thing, Thompson added. I want you to keep a journal of your traffic stops. Note your initial reason for suspicion, then what you actually found. Be honest with yourself about the patterns you see. The conversation continued as they sat in the SUV, the interior growing darker as night settled in. They talked about specific scenarios, about the difference between legitimate suspicion and bias-based assumptions, about the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. As their discussion drew to a close, Thompson turned to face Reynolds fully. You know why I chose to have this conversation instead of writing you up? Reynolds shook his head. Because 25 years ago, someone did the same for me. When I was a rookie, I made my own mistakes, had my own biases to overcome. An older officer took the time to guide me rather than punish me. He helped me become a better officer and eventually a better leader. The chief's words carried the weight of experience and wisdom. Our job isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about building trust, fostering understanding, and serving all members of our community with equal respect and dignity. Reynolds nodded, feeling something shift inside him. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one mistake. It was about the kind of officer he wanted to become. Tomorrow morning, report to Community Services, Thompson instructed. And Reynolds? Remember this moment. Let it guide your future interactions, not just with civilians, but with your fellow officers too. As Reynolds prepared to leave the SUV, Thompson added one final thought. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. What matters now is what you do with this experience. The young officer stepped out into the night air, standing straighter than he had when he first approached the SUV hours earlier. He had come to work expecting a routine patrol shift. Instead, he'd received a lesson that would shape the rest of his career. The next morning, Reynolds arrived at the police station 30 minutes early. His conversation with Chief Thompson had kept him awake most of the night, replaying in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as he walked toward the building, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. Inside the community services office, he found a small group of officers gathered for the morning briefing. Some faces he recognized, others were new to him. The room smelled of coffee and fresh donuts, a stereotype come to life, he thought with a slight smile. Officer Reynolds, a voice called from the doorway. He turned to see Chief Thompson standing there, looking fresh and composed despite the previous night's events. Walk with me. As they moved through the corridors, Reynolds noticed how other officers interacted with the chief, not with fear or mere respect, but with genuine warmth. Thompson knew everyone's names, asked about their families, remembered personal details that showed he cared about his team as people, not just employees. They entered a conference room where 3 other officers were already seated. Reynolds recognized them as veterans on the force, each with at least 15 years of experience. The chief closed the door behind them. I've asked these officers to share some of their experiences, Thompson explained. Each of them has had their own journey in understanding and overcoming bias in policing. Today, they're going to be honest with you about their mistakes and what they learned. The first officer, a gray-haired veteran named Wilson, cleared his throat. 20 years ago, I was just like you, Reynolds. Thought I was doing good police work by following my instincts. Took me pulling over an off-duty state trooper to realize my instincts were just prejudices in disguise. Reynolds listened as each officer shared similar stories. One had stopped a city council member based on nothing more than seeing an expensive car in a working-class neighborhood. Another had repeatedly patrolled certain areas more heavily based on assumptions about the residents. The hardest part, Officer Chen explained, was admitting to myself that I was part of the problem. I kept telling myself I was just being thorough, just doing my job. But I was really just reinforcing the same biases that had been passed down through generations of policing. As Reynolds absorbed their stories, Chief Thompson pulled out a stack of papers. These are complaint reports from the past year. I want you to read them. Not just the facts, but the emotions behind them. Every person who filed these complaints is a member of our community who felt targeted, diminished, or afraid because of an interaction with law enforcement. Reynolds began reading. The stories were diverse but shared common threads. People feeling humiliated during routine traffic stops, parents worried about their children being profiled, citizens feeling like strangers in their own neighborhoods. Now, Thompson said, I want you to share your story from last night. Tell these officers what happened and, more importantly, what you learned. Reynolds took a deep breath and began speaking. He described following the chief's SUV, his assumptions, the moment of realization, and the conversation that followed. As he spoke, he found himself understanding the events differently, seeing them through new eyes. The thing that strikes me now, he admitted, is how automatic my reactions were. I didn't even question why I found the situation suspicious. It was like I was working from a script I didn't even know I had memorized. Officer Wilson nodded. That's the first step, recognizing those automatic responses. The next step is harder, changing them. Chief Thompson stood up and walked to the whiteboard. Let's break this down. What are the actual indicators of suspicious behavior? Not assumptions, not stereotypes, but real, observable actions that should trigger a police response. For the next hour, they worked through scenarios, discussing the difference between legitimate police work and biased profiling. Reynolds found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about good instincts and police intuition. Here's what's going to happen next, Thompson announced. Each of these officers has agreed to mentor you. You'll ride with each of them for a week in different parts of the city. You'll meet community leaders, attend neighborhood meetings, and learn what real community policing looks like. Reynolds felt a mix of nervousness and gratitude. Thank you, sir, all of you. I want to learn from this. That's why we're here, Officer Chen smiled. Because you're not the first to struggle with this, and you won't be the last. But you're willing to learn, and that's what matters. As the meeting wrapped up, Chief Thompson held Reynolds back for a moment. One more thing. I want you to keep a journal of your experiences over the next few weeks. Write down your thoughts, your realizations, your struggles. This isn't for me or anyone else. It's for you. Sometimes the best learning happens when we're honest with ourselves on paper. Reynolds nodded, thinking about all the entries that would come from just this morning's meeting. And Reynolds. Thompson added, remember that change doesn't happen overnight. You'll make mistakes. You'll catch yourself falling back into old patterns. What matters is that you keep learning, keep growing, and keep working to be better. As Reynolds left the conference room, he felt different, not lighter, exactly, but more grounded. The weight of his badge felt more like a responsibility than an authority now. He thought about the shift ahead of him, about the citizens he would encounter, about the choices he would make. The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through the station windows. Reynolds walked back to his patrol car, notebook in hand, ready to begin his real education as a police officer. He had entered law enforcement wanting to make a difference. Now he understood that the first difference he needed to make was in himself. The events of the previous night hadn't been the end of something, but rather the beginning. As he sat in his patrol car, preparing for his shift, Reynolds opened his new journal and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it, he added a simple statement. Today, I start learning how to be the officer I always thought I was. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department had undergone significant changes. Chief Thompson stood at the podium in the community center, addressing a packed room of officers, community leaders, and residents. The walls were lined with posters showcasing new community outreach programs, and the energy in the room was palpable. When I became chief, Thompson began, I promised to build a department that truly served everyone in our community. Today, I want to share some of the progress we've made and introduce someone who's been instrumental in these changes. He gestured to Officer Reynolds, who stood up from his seat in the front row. The young officer had changed over the past months, not just in his appearance, which was still sharp and professional, but in the way he carried himself. There was a new awareness in his eyes, a deeper understanding of his role. Officer Reynolds is going to tell you about our new training program, Thompson continued. A program that was born from a single traffic stop that could have ended very differently. Reynolds took the podium, adjusting the microphone as he looked out over the crowd. 6 months ago, I pulled over a vehicle because I made assumptions about who belonged in which neighborhood. That vehicle turned out to be driven by Chief Thompson himself. A murmur went through the crowd, but Reynolds continued. Instead of disciplining me, the chief used that moment to create change. Not just for me, but for our entire department. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing statistics from before and after the new training program. In the past 6 months, we've reduced unwarranted traffic stops by 60%. Civilian complaints are down 45%. But more importantly, community engagement is up 80%. Reynolds explained how every officer now spent time in community outreach before getting their patrol assignment. They attended neighborhood meetings, participated in local events, and got to know the residents as people, not just civilians to be policed. We've created a mentorship program, he continued, where experienced officers work with rookies to identify and address unconscious bias. Every traffic stop, every interaction is reviewed not just for procedure, but for fairness and respect. The next slide showed photos of officers playing basketball with local kids, helping at community gardens, and attending neighborhood celebrations. This isn't just public relations, Reynolds explained. This is about understanding the communities we serve. It's about seeing people as people, not as statistics or stereotypes. Chief Thompson returned to the podium, standing beside Reynolds. But we're not just changing procedures, he added. We're changing culture. Officer Reynolds now leads our bias awareness training, sharing his personal experience to help other officers recognize and overcome their own prejudices. Reynolds nodded, remembering the journal entries from those first few weeks after the traffic stop. They had become the foundation for the training program, showing other officers that change was possible, that admitting mistakes wasn't a sign of weakness but of strength. The hardest part, Reynolds admitted to the crowd, was learning to question my own instincts. Realizing that what I thought was good police work was often just reinforcing harmful stereotypes. But once I started seeing people as individuals with their own stories and experiences, everything changed. He shared examples of how the new approach had led to better policing outcomes. Crime rates hadn't risen, they'd actually dropped in many areas as community trust increased and residents became more willing to work with law enforcement. We're not just enforcing laws anymore, Reynolds explained. We're building relationships. When I patrol now, I'm not looking for trouble, I'm looking for ways to help, to understand, to serve. A community leader stood up during the question period. How do you ensure these changes last? What happens when new officers join the force? Chief Thompson stepped forward to answer. Every new recruit goes through our enhanced training program. They learn about the history of policing in our community, both the good and the bad. They spend time with community leaders, hearing directly from residents about their experiences with law enforcement. Reynolds added, and most importantly, they learn that making mistakes isn't the end of their career, it's an opportunity for growth, just like that traffic stop was for me. The presentation concluded with announcements of new initiatives, a civilian oversight committee, regular community feedback sessions, and expanded training programs for all department members. As the crowd mingled afterward, Reynolds found himself speaking with a group of young officers. The biggest lesson, he told them, wasn't about procedures or protocols. It was about humanity. Every person we interact with has a story, has value, has rights. Our job is to protect those rights, not to decide who deserves them. Chief Thompson watched from across the room, seeing how far his department had come. The traffic stop that could have been just another statistic had instead become a catalyst for real change. Later that evening, as Reynolds prepared to start his patrol shift, he pulled out his journal, now filled with 6 months of observations and reflections. On a fresh page, he wrote, "Today we shared our story, but the real story is just beginning. Every shift, every interaction is a chance to prove that change is possible." He clipped his badge to his uniform, checked his equipment, and headed out to his patrol car. The sun was setting over the city, his city, and he knew that somewhere out there, someone else was about to learn the same lessons he had. Not through confrontation or punishment, but through understanding and growth. The streets looked different to him now. Where he once saw potential threats, he now saw community members. Where he once looked for suspicion, he now looked for opportunities to help. It wasn't just about being a better police officer, it was about being a better person. And that, perhaps, was the most lasting change of all. 1 year after the traffic stop incident, the city's police department had become a model for other departments across the country. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the training center as Chief Thompson addressed a room full of police chiefs and law enforcement leaders from neighboring cities. "A year ago, a simple traffic stop changed our entire department," Thompson began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Today, I want to show you how one moment of honest reflection led to lasting transformation." The presentation screen behind him displayed remarkable statistics: civilian complaints down by 70%, community trust levels up by 85%, and crime rates showing a steady decline across all neighborhoods. But the numbers weren't what made the chief most proud. "Officer Reynolds," Thompson called out, "please share your perspective on our journey." Reynolds, now promoted to training coordinator, stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, but it was his confident yet humble demeanor that caught everyone's attention. "When I pulled over Chief Thompson that night, I thought I was doing my job. What I didn't realize was that I was about to learn what my job really meant." He clicked through slides showing the department's new initiatives, community engagement programs, bias awareness training, and partnership projects with local organizations. "We didn't just change policies," Reynolds explained. "We changed minds, including my own." A police chief from a neighboring city raised his hand. "How did you handle resistance from veteran officers?" Reynolds smiled, remembering the early challenges. "We made it personal. Every officer has a story about a time they realized they were wrong about someone. We created safe spaces for sharing those stories, turning mistakes into teaching moments." The presentation continued with video testimonials from community members. An elderly resident spoke about feeling safer walking in her neighborhood. A business owner described his changed perspective on law enforcement. A teenage student shared how a local officer had become his mentor. "The key," Thompson explained, "was making everyone part of the solution. We didn't point fingers or assign blame. We acknowledged our shared responsibility to do better." Reynolds described the new training protocols they developed. Every new recruit now spent their first month working directly with community organizations before ever putting on a uniform. Veteran officers participated in regular exchange programs, spending time in different neighborhoods to better understand the communities they served. But the real change, Reynolds emphasized, happens in small moments. It's about seeing people as individuals, not statistics. It's about understanding that every interaction can either build trust or break it. The chief shared footage from body cameras showing positive interactions between officers and citizens. Simple moments, helping a stranded motorist, playing basketball with local kids, attending community events, that built bridges between law enforcement and residents. "We transformed our measure of success," Thompson explained. "Instead of counting tickets and arrests, we started counting positive community interactions, problem solved, and trust built." A section of the presentation focused on their new accountability measures. Every officer now carried a journal, documenting their daily interactions and reflecting on their decisions. Regular group discussions allowed them to share challenges and solutions openly. "Remember the journal you asked me to keep?" Reynolds asked the chief during a break. That simple exercise changed everything. It made me conscious of my thoughts, my assumptions, my biases. The afternoon session focused on practical implementation. Thompson and Reynolds worked with the visiting law enforcement leaders to develop action plans for their own departments. They addressed common challenges: budget constraints, resistant officers, skeptical communities. Change isn't easy, Thompson acknowledged. But the cost of not changing is far greater. We're not just protecting our communities, we're becoming part of them. As the day wound down, Reynolds shared a final story. He described a recent traffic stop he'd made, this time for a legitimate violation. The driver, nervous at first, had relaxed when Reynolds treated him with respect and explained the reason for the stop. That driver later came to one of our community meetings, Reynolds said. He told me that interaction changed his view of law enforcement. One positive encounter rippled out to affect his family, his friends, his whole community. The visiting officials left with more than just plans and protocols. They left with a vision of what policing could be, not as an opposing force, but as a true partner in community well-being. Later that evening, Thompson found Reynolds in his office, reviewing training materials for the next day's session. "You've come a long way," the chief observed. Reynolds nodded, thinking back to that night a year ago. "We all have. But there's still work to do." "There always will be," Thompson agreed. "That's why what we're doing matters. Every officer we train, every community we connect with, every mind we open, including our own, creates lasting change." As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through the office windows, both men knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. The department they'd built wasn't perfect, but it was constantly striving to be better. Reynolds picked up his journal, now one of many filled with reflections and insights. On the last page, he wrote, "True change isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them, growing through them, and using them to build a better future for everyone." The story of one traffic stop had become a blueprint for transformation, proving that real change begins with one moment of truth, one willing heart, and the courage to choose growth over comfort. As other departments across the country began adopting their methods, Thompson and Reynolds knew their journey wasn't ending, it was just beginning.